Sloth Uni. Training camp for the rest of the league is finally upon us. Most teams haven't even had more than 3 padded practices, but the propaganda is flying left and right. For today's lesson, we'll be going over some players getting some early camp hype and determining whether there's fire underneath all that smoke or if it's a whole lot of cap. We'll also be kicking off our fantasy football lessons before the season, as we'll be doing a breakdown on each team's fantasy options and how to value them moving forward. And we're going to end off our lesson with the Hall of Fame game thoughts and recaps. Before I get to talking too much, grab some grub, get comfortable, and bring out the tinfoil hats, because class is now in session. Kicking off the lesson with our first segment, smoke or cap. I know it sounds like they could both mean a little bit of the same thing, but where there's smoke, there's fire, usually. But I've been hearing a lot of roo-rah coming from these teams about some of these players, and we won't cover every single player who's been getting boosted, because we'll spread them out and pair them with some of the breakdowns coming out. But starting off our list, we have the Chiefs' newly acquired wide receiver, JuJu Smith-Schuster. Now, I'm personally a fan of JuJu, so I won't call him Boo Boo anymore, but he's been impressive in camp so far in his reportedly game report with Mahomes. Out of all the receivers the Chiefs brought in, I thought JuJu had the best chance to take the second option. In previous years, it had always been Kels and Tyreek, and there's never really been a solid third option, but now they have to try to find a solid second option again. And I suspect they could develop a third option this go around, since whoever takes the second option won't garner as many targets and attention as Tyreek Hill did. Some of their other receivers have been having success in camp like MVS and Sky Moore, but from what I've seen and heard, JuJu has been performing the best. It wasn't too long ago people were saying JuJu was the next superstar in the league, and he by far has the highest ceiling out of all these Chiefs receivers. People forget, he put up 1.4k yards and 7 touchdowns as the second option in Pittsburgh. He's only 25 and he's shown no signs of regression. The main reason his stats even went down in the first place was because Big Ben's arm was falling off the bone, and they started using him as a short yardage wide receiver. I had JuJu returning to form in a big way this season. I'm calling smoke on this one. I think it's a big old fire brewing in Kansas City. Hop aboard the train or get left at the station. Choo choo! Next up, we got Packers rookie Romeo Doubs. With Christian Watson on the PUP list, that paved the way for him to start making waves at camp. He's a 4th round draft pick out of Nevada, and by all reports, he's strung together quite a few strong practices. He's been torching the hell out of Eric Stokes quite a few times as well. Unfortunately, some teams, including the Packers in this case, don't allow many filming at practice, so there's no visual of him doing this. I know a lot of fans have complained about teams doing this, saying they're being too paranoid, but I actually agree with the teams in this case. If you telegraph what your roster or play calling could look like before the season, you're giving your opponents extra film to study you. Personally, I'd love to see my team's training camp broadcasting for the duration of it, but I understand why that can't happen. Back to Romeo though. While he's having a really solid camp, so has Allen Lazard, who by all accounts looks like he's ready to take over the mantle. Not saying Romeo Doubs can't have a role in this offense, because Lazard won't get all the targets, but if you're expecting him to have a nuclear season, pipe down a bit, because I'm calling cap on this one. Next up, we got Rondale Moore. With Christian Kirk leaving and D-Hop getting a 6-game suspension, quite a few target slots have opened up in Arizona. Marquise Brown is expected to take up the number 1 role with Hopkins gone, but the Cardinals often use 3 and 4 wide receiver sets. They still have AJ Green, but he's been showing signs of slowing down for quite some time. This is where second-year wideout Rondale Moore comes in. Cliff Kingsbury's been raving about him all offseason. He had an up-and-down rookie season, but was buried because of their depth at wide receiver. The streets are calling him the next Debo, but I'm not quite ready to board that ship just yet. They've experimented with him in the backfield, and with Chase Edmonds leaving, there's no clear replacement on the roster for him. There definitely is a scenario where he gets more work out of the backfield this season if they choose to use him that way. Cliff has already stated he's expected to have a huge role in this offense, but coaches always say that around this time of year. I can easily see him taking Christian Kirk's role in this offense though, and I think he'll be pretty productive while D-Hop is out. His season-long value will depend on if he can beat out AJ Green, and honestly, if he can't do that, I'm not too bullish on him either way it goes, because AJ Green is a shell of himself at this point. I'm not going to call cap on this one, but I also think there's not enough argument to say there's a fire brewing. I'll say TBD, but leaning more towards the smoke side. There's enough smoke to be noticeable, but nobody's calling the fire department. Somebody could just be having a nice little barbecue around the corner, honestly. Next person up, Jeudy, or just Jeudy as many like to call him, has been getting raved about by teammates and coaches all offseason, and even this previous year by the people he's played against. Going into the offseason, I was all in on Courtland Sutton being the number 1. After further review, my stance has changed. From all reports that I've heard, it appears that Jerry is getting prepped for the #1 role and has developed the best chemistry with Russ out of all the receivers. Broncos safety Justin Simmons said that they've been moving him all around the field as well. He was highly touted coming out of Alabama, and his career has been derailed by a combination of injuries and bad QB play. While I am, and always will be, on the train that great wide receivers can get it done regardless of who their QB is, he does have somewhat of an excuse because his carousel of QBs have been pretty stinky. He hasn't had any great seasons, but he's done alright and shown enough through his trials and tribulations. Between him and Courtland Sutton, one or both of them was going to rise to the top and have a great season. Because Russ is still an elite quarterback. It seems like Jerry is going to be the one who's stepping up though. Fire department is on their way because there's some thick, hearty smoke in the air. This next player is one of my personal favorites. George Pickens out of Georgia, now with the Pittsburgh Steelers, has been making some waves in camp. Ever since the loss to AB, the Steelers have been missing an alpha receiver. JuJu and Deontay are both very talented, and I still believe Deontay will remain the top target for this team to start the year. But I wouldn't be surprised if Pickens ends up taking over before the year is out. From all videos and reports, Pickens looks the part of a 1. There's no telling how the target share will be broken down since there's a new quarterback, so if Pickens continues to grow his connection with presumed starter Mitchell Trubisky, I don't know if Mitchell Trubisky could lose his job because Mason Rudolph has been looking like the best quarterback. Street's been saying Mitch been trash. But it's camp. We're going to give it some time. I'm going to give it some preseason. But Street's been saying Mitch been looking pretty bad. If Mason Rudolph's starting the season, I don't know how I feel about any of these Steelers wide receivers. But anyways, Pickens could hit the round running if he develops a nice chemistry with Mitchell Trubisky, who should start the season. All the elite traits he showed in college seems like they're translating well into the league. Should Mitchell Trubisky be competent as a starter, George Pickens has all the makings of a league-winning sleeping giant. Should he come correct in the second half of the season, I don't think he's going to be doing too much in the first half, considering it's going to be the Deontay Johnson show, more than likely. But I'm calling smoke on this one. It's a bonfire right now, but there's a nice little flame going. It could easily turn into a forest fire though. Last up, we got Allen Robinson. All reports from camp are that he and Matthew Stafford are really clicking, and he's been integrated into the offense very well. I'm taking this one with a slight grain of salt, mainly because what we saw in the field, A-Rob, the last we saw him, it wasn't very pretty, it was very stinky. A-Rob looked washed. You can say it was just his situation all you want, but explain Darnell Mooney's success then. A-Rob wasn't even the one on his own team last year. The only excuse he could possibly have is that he was just mentally checked out last year, did not want to play for the Bears anymore. You know what? I get it. If he didn't want to play for the Bears anymore, I get it. But that's the only excuse he got. Back on track though. I know he also won't be the one in the Rams, but that's not the point. The Allen Robinson that we all knew and loved is likely dead and gone. He may not be a shell of himself, and I don't believe he's a shell of himself, but I do believe his days of being elite are over. I will say this though, that these reports are a good sign. All the videos that have been coming out of him looks very good, and he could very well have a productive season, and I think he'll have a productive season. But I think we should hold off on sounding the alarms. I've been rising on him though. I've been rising a lot on him though. I'm not sounding any alarms, but I think it's a step in the right direction. I'm not too sold on how high his potential ceiling could be. They're in LA though, so who really knows where this smoke is coming from, if you know what I mean. I don't think it's from a fire, but I'm not ready to call it cap yet. It's another TBD, but for the moment, I'm leaning a little smoke. Allen Robinson is looking nice. Matthew Stafford gonna put up some stats. That offense is gonna put up some points. The stars are aligning for A-Rob. Will he step up to the plate is the real question. Now, it's time for the meat and potatoes of this lesson. We're going to be going over the fantasy outlook of teams, starting with the NFC West. I know I rarely ever show the NFC some love to start, so I decided to switch it up a bit. But you know me, always playing it fair. So we're going in order of standings. We just finished talking about A-Rob, but we're dragging him and his team back into the spotlight. LA Rams, y'all up to bat. Starting off with the most important position on the team, the quarterback. Matthew Stafford finished the last season as a QB5, but it didn't really feel like it. He didn't have too many games where he just tanked your roster, but he also didn't have too many games where he won you your week. He was just king consistency. The big question is, can he repeat his success in year 2 of the Sean McVay offense? He still has Cooper Kupp, but Robert Woods and OBJ are gone. They were both very important parts of that offense. I have him at QB 12, but my rankings don't get solidified until after camp and around mid-preseason, so things are very likely to change. But I don't believe he'll keep the same level of consistency that he put out this last season. I'm not predicting a complete fall off because he's still one of the best quarterbacks in the league in my opinion, but I'd be surprised if he threw for 40 touchdowns again. It's just a bit more difficult trying to predict players who just had 1 year in a new system. There's no real sample size to base things off of, and for all we know, last year could have just been the baseline for Stafford and Kupp, which would be scary for the league. Very rarely though do people ever have crazy seasons like they did and proceed to one-up themselves the next year. At where he's going though in rounds 8 to 10, he's definitely a steal in the lower end of that bar. He's currently going at the quarterback 12, which I believe is his floor, and he has all the tools and ability to finish in the top 7. I'm not sure if I'd personally take him in the 8th, considering you can get Brady a bit later and Trey Lance around the same area, but 9 to 10 will definitely pique my interest. I personally find myself taking Brady 2 or Kirk Cousins in rounds 11 through 14, with Brady going the earliest in 11. You could probably get Brady a little later in your league if they're a bit ageist. With his value, I could see Matthew Stafford breaking even at bare minimum. Next up, we have the top fantasy option on this team. Cooper Kupp was the number 1 wide receiver this past season, and I've been looking for a possible way for him not to repeat. And the only thing I could think of was an injury that could happen to literally any other player. If I had the number 1 overall pick, he'd definitely be one of the players I'd be eyeing. With Van Jefferson's status week 1 up in the air, Stafford could look to lean on him even more if possible. I will say though, I forgot to point out, Stafford has been dealing, reportedly, with a bit of an elbow injury, so keep an eye out for that one. We're not sounding any alarms on it, but it's definitely something to monitor. Back on track again. There's only 2 people who I would take over Cooper Kupp, and there's 2 people who I would consider taking over Cooper Kupp. Jonathan Taylor and CMC are the only 2 people I would actually take over Cooper Kupp, but it's close enough to take Kupp over both of them as well. Derrick Henry and Justin Jefferson are the other 2 I'd consider taking over Cooper Kupp. Gotta put an emphasis on the consider, because I don't think I would personally take them over Cooper Kupp, but you can make an argument. If I had the 101 though, it'd be a 50-50 between JT, CMC, and Cooper Kupp. Henry has all the arguments in the world to go 101 as well, but the foot injury has me a smidgen shook. I love Justin Jefferson, some Jay Juttas, and I would rarely find myself taking him over Cooper Kupp. But I understand why somebody would. Kupp is one of the best fantasy football players available, and until he shows you otherwise, you should draft him as such. I do expect him to slightly take a step back though, but he can take a step back and easily have room to finish as the wide receiver 1 again. Switching up positions, over to running back with Cam Akers. I currently have him as running back 16. He was a bit lower and could very well rise or fall depending on how the rest of the offseason goes. I was off of the Cam Akers train because Achilles tear for running backs have been dangerous and a tough injury to come back from. But the Rams have showed that they were willing to feed him as the lead back in his games back from injury when he wasn't even 100%. He's still very young at 23, so with today's medical advancements, he shouldn't have too much trouble bouncing back, especially now that he's had an entire offseason to recover his body. He has all the talent in the world to finish at top 12 at this position, but the only thing keeping me from ranking him that high is the threat of Darrell Henderson stealing carries. I don't finalize ranking until after the second preseason game, so there's still a lot of movement that could happen. In a high-power offense that is bound to score a lot of points, if he's the workhorse, he could easily find his way into the top 12. If you're on a side that thinks he'll recover from his injury just fine, it's hard to be down on him. On the flip side, if he does end up splitting carries with Darrell Henderson, or is hindered by the injury in any way, he drops significantly in my rankings. Sean McVay did allude to it, and he's gone running back by committee more than once when all their current running backs plus Sony Michel were healthy, so it's a thing to keep an eye out for. Moving on to the most controversial player on this team in Allen Robinson. I'm not too big a believer in Robinson this year, but I've definitely been rising on him, and I won't be drafting him in many of my leagues unless the value is right. At his price right now, especially with the wide receivers going around him, I find myself with a grand total of a big fat 0 shares. I do acknowledge though, again, the role he'll play as the second option in the Rams offense will be very fruitful, but I don't have faith that he'll go back to being the elite wide receiver that we saw in the past, and some people are drafting him as such. I have him at wide receiver 35, and honestly, that's a bit too low. And if he does have a nice season, which I very well think he could, I could see him sliding into the higher 20s, maybe mid 20s, but I definitely don't see him reaching the low 20s. It's still a possibility though, but not very likely in my opinion. Again, Matthew Stafford is going to put up stats, and Cooper Kupp isn't going to catch all the passes, so realistically, he's bound to have some type of success should he stay healthy. I just personally think you can get more bang for your buck with the other options going around his price in Elijah Moore, Jerry Jeudy, and Treylon Burks. I'd also throw out Michael Thomas in the mix. Michael Thomas also has some red flags and questions going into this season, but I'd rather take risk on him being the presumed 1 than A-Rob being a middle of the pack to high end 2. Last up, we got Tyler Higbee. His production, in my eyes, is directly correlated to how good Allen Robinson is. I currently have him as my tight end 21. Should Robinson not be as much of a target hog as Robert Woods or OBJ have been in the same role, he could open up a path for other people to eat a bit more. Higbee still wouldn't become an every week starter, and I personally wouldn't draft him unless you play in a deeper league or a 2 tight end league. He's a break in case of emergency option, and I pray none of you are ever in that type of emergency. An honorable mention for this team is Darrell Henderson. I don't think he'll have too much value as the second back in this rotation. Even if they do run a committee, he would have to score touchdowns to be relevant. He'd be worth drafting as a late round fire on the off chance that Cam Akers gets injured, but Henderson hasn't exactly been a healthy camper himself, so buyer beware. I have him as my RB41 and wouldn't target him unless it was deeper leagues or best ball. Moving on to the next team. Starting off with the quarterback again, and this time, we got my favorite of the bunch. I'm a bit higher on this guy than a lot of other people, but Kyler Murray is my QB2. Disregarding Superflex, he's the only quarterback I would even consider taking early. By early, I mean like rounds 5 through 7. I'd be eyeing him in round 5 depending on how the board is, but 6 and 7, if he's available and my team is stable, I'd be much more inclined to pull the trigger. A lot of people are turned off by how he's ended his past few seasons, and I understand. He's gotten injured and played through them to his credit, but his play also dropped in the process. When he's healthy and on one, he's one of the best fantasy quarterbacks this league has to offer, and he's just got one of the most electric wide receivers in the game. His peak is as high as any other quarterback in the league because of his play style as well. He won't get injured every season, or at least I hope, knock on some wood, so he's bound to continue his success throughout the year at some point. I think he'll be in MVP conversations this year. His stock is as low as it's going to get right now, with people having a sour taste in their mouth from his playoff breakdown and all his offseason drama. I don't find myself taking quarterbacks that early since I can find one later in the draft, but Kyler is such a beast, man. I'm highly against drafting QBs before round 7, but he'd definitely be an exception. Through the first 7 weeks, he was a QB3, and he was 1 point behind the QB2 and 7 points behind the QB1. Through 13 weeks, he was the number 1 quarterback in points per game, averaging 23.95 points. I'm expecting this offense to take a step forward, and getting DeAndre Hopkins back in week 7 should only help their late season struggles. It's full steam ahead with the Kyler Murray hype train. On to the newcomer for this team, Marquise Hollywood Brown. I currently have him just inside at wide receiver 25. Depending on the target split, when just how much he cooks in the first 6 weeks. Through the first 10 weeks of last season, he was the wide receiver Lamar to injury. Keep in mind, he was doing this as the second wide receivers ahead of him in the first 10 weeks. Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Devontae Adams, Jamar Chase. He was that good. No disrespect to Lamar, because contrary to what a lot of but Hollywood was being held back by the offense. A system that's built for tight to a wide receiver friendly team as a top option through the first 6 weeks. Hot start and put your team in prime position to make the playoffs. He's going to become the number 2 when DeAndre Hopkins gets back. Yeah, like supporting 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers. Christian option duties with Rusty Dusty AJ Green last year. This shouldn't have to be said, but Marquise Brown is a lot better than Christian. The league on fire and finish as a top 7 wide receiver, but finishing within for him. Players with hot starts to the season are the exact kind of players that lead you to the playoffs. Side for a player who have the same effect but in the back end of the season, I have him just inside my top 30 at wide receiver 30. Season, he'd definitely be in the top 10, and when he gets back from his suspension, his body should be fully. He's currently going at wide receiver 29 and sometimes later depending. 2 to 3 wide receivers ahead of him and already have 1 to 2 solid running out your roster. It's an extra bonus if your league has IR spots. When he comes back, your roster will be on steroids. Before receiver 12, not exactly where you're used to seeing him, but he and Kyler had a bit of getting carried by touchdowns, but he's always been a good touchdown wide receiver throughout his career. In his first season with Kyler Murray, he was a wide receiver 4 in the season. He's still one of the best wide receivers in the game until he proves otherwise. To sustain success within the first 6 weeks because he can only 6 or 1-5 team. The playoffs, it'll 1000% make it ridiculously. Maybe the most underrated player on this team. The amount of people who are down, how much these same people don't pay attention to NFL games. Predictable stat for any player, but the Cardinals used their running back rates in the league. Even when they had Kenyon Drake, he was one of the NFL. Cliff Kingsbury loves feeding his running back to the goal line, and I don't think they'll, especially after the success Connor just had. They parted ways with Chase Edmonds, so they're right now. And if Connor slides, certainly outperform his ADP. I currently have him as my RB50. If he's stepping up as a pass catcher, then he's definitely getting moved up. The touchdown, still have him with over 12 on the season. He finishes the RB5 in 2 games, and now he's getting the whole backfield to himself, presumably. Get it together, people. We got a double time 2-pack for the pair play the same position and will be battling for the same role. So we're going to talk about with AJ Green and Rondale Moore. Whoever wins out a hot commodity for the first 6 weeks of the season. AJ Green beats out Rondale Moore. I'll be severely disappointed and out on. No disrespect to AJ Green, who's had a fine career. For him to hang up the cleats. He's a solid wide receiver who I'm sure will make a handful of plays for the Arizona Cardinals, but his time as a notable playmaker is over. Rondale Moore, on the other hand, has been getting raved about by Cliff Kingsbury all off season. As we said before in Smoker Cap, we have our detectives, the Sloth Uni, on the case to see for sure if it's a whole lot of camp coach chit chat or if he's seriously going to have a large role in this offense. I have him as wide receiver 45, and I'm drafting him everywhere if he slips. I think he'll get off to a very hot start to the season, but I'd definitely be looking to trade him for a better asset the closer he gets to D-Hop's return. He could very well be a top 25 wide receiver throughout the first 6 weeks of the season. After that, he could still have some games, but not as often, so best ball is the best place for Rondale Moore drafters. Next up for the double pack and last on the roster are Zach Ertz and Trey McBride. This should be a pretty open and shut case, at least when it comes to McBride. I love him as a talent, but historically, rookie tight ends just don't produce much in the league. I highly doubt he'll be fantasy relevant this year, especially since Zach Ertz is still on our roster. There have been talks about them using 2 tight end sets, and McBride will have some catches, he'll have some games, but it won't be consistent. Since Zach Ertz first got traded to the Cardinals in week 7 and on, he was the number 4 tight end on the season. I currently have him as my tight end 8. He's another player who could see a significant boost while D-Hop is out. Literally all the Cardinals pass catchers are going to get a power boost for the first 6 weeks of the season. Zach Ertz was struggling in a split of snaps with Dallas Goedert when he was on the Eagles, and he had been requesting a trade for quite some time. After finally getting his much needed change of scenery, he showed some signs of life. In what I expect to be a very high-powered offense, he should provide some value in the desert lands of the tight end position. We're going to throw out another honorable mention in Eno Benjamin, who is the favorite to take over for Chase Edmonds. I doubt he'll be as successful as Edmonds was, but if he does indeed take over that role, he could have some value in best ball leagues. On to the next team. You know what? We started off with quarterbacks for every single team so far. You know, it only makes sense if we continued the trend and got right into Trey Lance. I have him as my QB 14, but the way he's been looking in camp, and with all the buzz and my personal hype, it's looking like he's for sure going to get moved up before I finalize rankings. The man who the 49ers auctioned their future away for is finally going to be stepping onto the field this season. They didn't give themselves too much of a choice in the matter considering the draft capital they spent on him, but I feel like if Jimmy G was truly better than him at this point, then he'd be the team's current starter and not on a trade block. I think the Niners are competent enough of a team to roll out whoever gives them the best chance to win on Sunday. With this being said, I do think he's more talented than Jimmy G, and he definitely has a higher floor and ceiling because of his rushing ability. Now he has ample talent around him in Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, and George Kittle, paired with a great running back in Elijah Mitchell and a great offensive mind in Kyle Shanahan. He has all the tools around him to be successful in this league. He could very well pop off and have a similar season to Jalen Hurts rushing wise. Not to the same extreme, but I think he'll have a lot better passing stats. Jalen Hurts finishes the QB9 on the year and only threw for 16 touchdowns. The power of rushing QBs was on full display last year, and with the influx of dual QBs into the league, I don't think it'll slow down anytime soon. I often find myself drafting him over some of the QBs I have ranked over him, so he's more likely than not getting a boost in rankings. You know, it's hard ranking all these 49ers pass catchers because I love them all, but realistically, they can't all pop off this season. If they do, none of them will be able to have a monster season just because of how many there are of them. I have them all having pretty good seasons, but I had to lower one of my personal favorites in Deebo Samuel. I have him as my wide receiver 11, but should any of these pass catchers get injured, he has all the talent and opportunity to finish as the wide receiver 1. Sadly though, a lot of Deebo's success early on last year, receiving wise, was partly due to no George Kittle and Brandon Ayuk forgetting how to play football. When Kittle came back from injury and Brandon Ayuk started figuring it out, which coincidentally came in the same week, Deebo Samuel only surpassed 7 targets in a game twice through the span of 10 weeks. That's a pretty large sample size. How did he sustain his fantasy dominance, you ask? He was moderately used in a run game and scored a whopping 7 touchdowns in that span. They were using him the same way Atlanta used Cordero Patterson, and that's a very productive role to be in fantasy-wise. My only pause on it is that touchdowns aren't a very predictable stat. Anybody can score a touchdown in the game. It's just kind of the luck of the draw. There are ways to see who will have a better chance of scoring by when and where they're getting used, and Deebo was used a lot in the red zone, so if he's in the same role, there's a good chance for him to repeat. But if some of those TDs were to go to Elijah Mitchell or Trey Lance, then people should be a lot lower on Deebo than what they are. He should get a boost in receiving due to the better QB play, but I think his total receiving numbers are going to go down this year. Next pass catcher we have up to the plate is Brandon Ayuk. I was all in on him in the second half of his rookie year, and he was one of the very first Sloths at Sloth Uni. I was high on him last year as well, but he ended up in Shanahan's doghouse to start the season and got off to a slow start. Once he finally got out though, he continued to flash the talent that we saw in his rookie year. Every single season these past few years, there's been multiple teams that have 2 wide receivers finishing in the top 20. And I think the 49ers have a very good chance to be one of those teams. I have Ayuk just outside of my top 20 though at wide receiver 22. I think he'll have his best season to date, but that's more because of catches and yards. I have him just under 1K yards with 900 and a bit under 10 touchdowns with 7. Reports from camp are that he looks like he stepped up his gains, and I definitely think it'll show in his stats this year. Him and Trey Lance really seem to be developing a real connection. I think people are dangerously low on the 49ers offense this year because of the QB switch, and you should definitely buy the dip. The last and certainly not least pass catcher we have up is George Kittle, who I project is the top option for this team. I currently have him as my tight end 3 on the season. He's still one of the best in the league, and with the injuries these past few seasons, it seems people forgotten who this man is. But don't worry, he's about to remind y'all. Last season after he came back from the injury, he was a tight end 2 in the season. Yes, he disappointed you in the playoffs, but you shouldn't hold it against him. He's going in rounds 5 through 6, sometimes even 7 depending on your league. That's the equivalent of robbing the most high-profile bank in the world. I'm old enough to remember when people were drafting Travis Kelce and George Kittle in the first and second rounds. The only thing that's changed now is that he's quite possibly had the best quarterback that he's ever played with in his career. Do not drink the Kool-Aid, my brethren. Last up on the 49ers is someone who is very near and dear to my heart, as he aided me in getting a chip last year, Elijah Mitchell. I have him just inside my top 20 at running back 20, but he quietly had an extremely impressive rookie campaign, racking up just under 1K rushing yards at 963, but he reached 1K total yards with 137 receiving yards to boot. He did this while missing 6 games, so his totals would have been even higher. People are shying away from him because of reports and the stigma that the Niners feature a running back by committee, which on the surface is what it appears to be, but it's really a combination of two things. There's so much injury and turnover at the position for that team that they do indeed have multiple running backs for the duration of the season. But when there's a clear and healthy starter, they use him as the lead back. They do of course mix in multiple guys, but at the clip they run the football, their lead back gets more than enough work to be productive. Mitchell had 207 carries through 11 games, which is an average of 18.8 carries a game. He's one of my favorite mid-round running backs to target if you're set at wide receiver early in the draft. The only downside is that he doesn't get much work in the receiving game, and if the Niners continue to use Deebo Samuel out of the backfield in the red zone, he could lose out on some touchdown opportunities. Just like Samuel as well though, he has Trey Lance right there ready to vulture some touchdowns too. I would have him higher in my rankings, but his peak is capped for those reasons, so I'd rather have a few more people who are more involved in the passing game. Last team up. We've been starting off with QBs for every single team so far, and finally, we have the opportunity to switch it up because the Seahawks quarterback should not be drafted unless you're in a deep Superflex league. But I'll touch on them just for those people though. I have Geno Smith ranked at QB 32, and by all reports, it looks like he's miles ahead of Drew Lock in this battle because Geno has been getting nearly all the reps with first team. Both of them though have looked like, how should I put this nicely, heaping piles of trash. Alright, that was a little bit uncalled for, but this Seahawks offense has looked horrendous in camp. Even in deep Superflex leagues, these guys will be the very last quarterbacks off the board for me. I know I said we weren't going to start off with quarterbacks again, but it was just too bright for the picking. Moving on to what will likely be the best fantasy option for this team in Rashad Penny. I currently have him as my running back 17. I've been rising a lot on him this offseason, especially with his price sliding. Pete Carroll came out and said he'd get the majority of the carries this season, and with his performance to end the season last year, he deserves it. From weeks 13 and on, he was the number 1 scoring running back in fantasy, and from weeks 14 and on, he was the number 1 in total points and points per game. He's a former first round pick, but never really felt like it because he's been so injured the majority of his career. He's only played 37 games in 4 years, so he isn't exactly the most reliable player. That's part of the reason why the Seahawks went out and drafted Kenneth Walker. One of the other reasons was because now retired Chris Carson had suffered a career-threatening neck injury and his future was uncertain. They had many questions at running back and had to address it. But people are drafting Kenneth Walker over Rashad Penny, which is asinine. There haven't been many instances where the backup running back was drafted before the starter. The first one that comes to mind was Leonard Fournette and Ronald Jones last year, but there are questions about who the starter would actually be. Penny is guaranteed to lead the backfield. People are just predicting an injury, which with Penny's history is understandable, but injuries can happen to literally anybody, and for all we know, he could pull off his first healthy season. Next up, we got DK Metcalf. These pass catchers aren't very intriguing to me this year, considering who their QB will be, but if the price is right, I'd draft DK. I dabble in DK. He's too talented of a wide receiver to let him fall too far in drafts. Even with Geno Smith last year, he still found a way to be productive, and I think he'll do it again this year. I have him at wide receiver 25, and it's a bit too low for him to be fair. I just can't rate a Geno Smith pass catcher within the top 20, even though realistically he may just finish there. If he does finish in the top 20, it'd definitely be within the 16 to 20 range. Geno Smith isn't the worst option at quarterback, but reports from camp about this offense have given me pause on drafting DK, even at a discount. I doubt he'll catch too many passes this year, so you'll just be relying on big plays and TDs, which isn't what I look for in wide receivers on bad offenses. He'll be a garbage time merchant this year for sure, but he's also the only pass catcher I'm even a tad bit interested in from this team. Next up, the Seahawks really should have done Tyler Lockett a favor and traded him before this season. He'll be 30 years old at the start of this season and will be catching passes from Geno Smith or Drew Lock. I have him as my wide receiver 46, and honestly, I don't feel bad about it. I'm fading him in all drafts, and if I had to start him, I wouldn't feel confident about it at all. I still think he has some fuel left in the tank, but sadly his final few years may just be wasted with bad quarterback play. Next up, we got our last honorable mention with Kenneth Walker. He won't have too much value unless Penny gets injured, but in the event that he does, I'd have him slightly lower than what Penny was ranked. I currently have him in my RB40 and wouldn't target him unless you're also taking Rashad Penny. He could be used as a trade piece to the Penny owner, but he would be sitting on your bench until injury otherwise. Now it's time for the Hall of Fame game recap. Football season is officially back. We got a little taste of what's to come. It was a good teaser though. If you're not following Sloth Uni on Twitter, you're missing out because all of our betting picks for the Hall of Fame game hit. Starting off the season right, going 4 for 4 for picks like a Wendy's value meal. I'll be posting picks every week until the Super Bowl on Twitter, so tune in for that. Getting into this game though, it went pretty much how I expected it to. I wouldn't put too much stock into this because it's the first preseason game and very few starters even played. The Jaguars just looked abysmal though. Doug Peterson did not have these boys ready to play whatsoever. Their defense looked okay, but their offense was a mess. I need to see how Trevor Lawrence and the starters look before I give any real stock into anything. The Raiders, on the other hand, came to play. The over and the over-under was looking scary, especially with how anemic the Jaguars' offense looked, but the Raiders put on for Sloth Uni. Josh McDaniels had this offensive scheme looking very nice. I was already high on Josh Jacobs going into this season, and he just gave us a little reminder of who he was with the few carries he had. The Raiders' run game in previous years have been pitiful to watch, but it seems like McDaniels has brought that scheme that we saw the Patriots running backs feasting with into Las Vegas without missing a beat. The thing that surprised me the most was how the Raiders' defense looked. They brought in Patrick Graham to be the defensive coordinator, and he spent some time in Miami and was handpicked by Brian Flores to be our defensive coordinator. But he left to go to the Giants because it was a long-time dream of his. While in Miami, the defense looked very nice as well, and he said he learned a lot from Flores in Miami. When he was in New York, he took the multiple defensive scheme with him, and the Giants' defense last year looked very good under him as well. If he works that same magic with the Raiders' defense, then they could very well make a run for the division title. They're a team that people have been sleeping on because they arguably have the worst quarterback in their division, but Derek Carr is no scrub. Their roster is very good and made the playoffs just a year before. It's not like they got worse because all they did was just add one of the best receivers and pass rushers in the game and found a head coach. I was intrigued by the Raiders before, but now they have my attention. And with that, we're all wrapped up for this lesson. We'll be dropping more breakdowns and camp rumors as we get closer to the season. I likely won't do a recap on all the preseason games, but if anything noteworthy happens in them, we'll definitely have to talk about it. As always, if you enjoyed, leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out our Twitter at Sloth University and our TikTok using the same handle for some extracurricular activities. Most importantly, spread love and stay safe. Class dismissed.
All right, kid, here's the deal. At any given time, there are around 1,500 aliens on the planet. Most of them right here in Manhattan. And most of them are decent enough. They're just trying to make a living.
Cab drivers.
No, not as many as you'd think. Humans, for the most part, don't have a clue. They don't want one or need one either. They're happy. They think they have a good bead on things.
But why the big secret? People are smart. They can handle it.
The person is smart. People are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals, and you know it. 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the Earth was flat. And 15 minutes ago, you knew that people were alone on this planet.
Imagine what you'll know tomorrow.